Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, December 3rd, 2025, for our webinar as we look ahead to next year's legislative session. My name is Ozzy Arroyo with the College Success Foundation, also joined by our Director of Government Relations and Advocacy, Yokiko. I'll let her introduce herself here shortly, but first, just wanted to go over a couple quick items. So as always, this webinar will be recorded and will be posted to the Washington Passport Network's YouTube channel and also to the webinar page on our website as soon as we can. Also, this meeting format is intended to encourage questions and participation. So if at any moment you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function or just drop your question in the chat, and Yokiko or myself will take a look and fill that question out. We'll also save some time at the very end for questions and conversation. And then another note, there will be a survey at the end, so please stay tuned. It's super quick, so we'll be sure to share it out at the end as well as in our follow-up email. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it on over to Yokiko.
Thank you so much, Ozzy. And I got to toggle between screens. So excited to be here with you all. I'm going to go over the agenda and then I'll go into the introduction so it kind of flows with the presentation. So we have, about an hour together, and we're just going to go over some basics about like what happens during the legislative session, how does it function, how do you navigate it, and then how can you participate and engage. So hopefully you won't feel like a complete fish out of water if you ever decide to do some legislative engagement. A little bit about me. My name is Yokiko Hayashi-Saguil. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been with the College Success Foundation for a year as of last month. And I serve as the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy, and I'm thrilled to be here with the Passport Network because the students that you serve and the partners that you work with are so critical to ensuring that Washington has an equitable education system for college students and for their own thriving. And so I'm very excited to be with you all. I've worked in higher education for over 15 years, which feels like a crime because I can't be that old. I swear, just 2000 was like 4 years ago, not 25. So that's kind of nuts, but very happy to be here and to be working in this space. I've spent my time working in admissions, financial aid, and then the last several years I've been working in policy, both as a policy associate where I was doing policy analysis and bill advocacy and partner engagement. So excited to kind of walk you through a little bit about how my work rolls. And on a personal note, I do have a tiny human who's homesick. So if you see my eyes dart across the screen, I'm probably looking at a tiny human, but I am fully committed to sharing this information with you all. So as a very high level overview, just a general reminder to put the government into context. When we look at the federal government, there are three equal branches, which is the executive, legislative, and judicial. For those of us that are maybe a little bit older, remembering the Schoolhouse Rock, the I'm Just a Bill, and they kind of talk about each of the three sections. So it's really important to remember, they all hold the same amount of power, which is meant to do a balancing act between the three. And that's very important to kind of keep your eye on. Now, there is sort of the overarching structure that happens for the federal government, which goes across all of our states. And then what does that mean for Washington State? Well, it's pretty much mirroring the exact same thing. We have our own executive branch, which is our governor, right now, who is Governor Ferguson, our legislative body, which is made of our state Senate and House of Representatives. And then we also have our own state courts with our own state Supreme Court. So those three equal branches work together to have our own state function and have our own governance. So with that in mind, to understand our legislature a little bit more deeply, there are two chambers. We have an upper chamber and a lower chamber. And that means that you're looking at the upper chamber would be the Senate, lower chamber would be the House of Representatives. We have 49 legislative districts, which is where you will see we have one senator for every legislative district and two representatives from every legislative district. It's important to note that our legislature is a part-time legislature. So there are other states who do it differently, but that's really important to Washington State because that means that people who are elected as senators or representatives are only working as a public servant in that capacity actively during the legislative session, and they hold other jobs or responsibilities outside of that. So you'll see that a lot of members of our legislature have roles in higher education. Some are teachers, there are business owners, there are attorneys, there are folks who do all different types of professions outside of working in the legislature, which enhances their engagement and the work that they do during session. So it's something to be mindful of, is that the busy season is when session starts, and that we call it the interim, which is what happens after the legislature closes its session, and it's kind of that space in between. So our part-time legislature also works on a biennial cycle. So you'll see that our legislative processes and our budget processes are functioning on a 2-year cycle. So every year, our legislative session begins on the second Monday. So for 2026, our legislative session will begin on January 12th. The session starting in January will be a short session, and that means that it is supplemental because we are in the second year of the biennium. So we will be deciding the second half of funding for the biennium, and then anticipating how we prepare for the next biennium. So last session in 2025 was 105 days, and that was the first year of the biennium, and now we are entering into the second year here, which means it's going to be a lot shorter. It's going to be only 60. We will see if it sticks to that, so we can navigate it. But what's really probably the most simple way I can describe it is that because legislative sessions are either 100 or 60 days, they move really quickly. So it kind of works what feels like a tornado because it is happening all at once. But it's really important because they cram in a whole lot of work in a short amount of time. So what's really important to consider is that there are two types of rules and laws that we have in Washington State, and you might hear these two different acronyms thrown out there, which is an RCW, which is the Revised Code of Washington, which is the state laws, and then you might hear a WAC, which is the Washington Administrative Code. So those are the rules that are enforced and applied from the laws that are passed. So you'll see that sometimes bills come through and they are making suggestions or proposed changes to either the RCW or to the WAC, but it's important to kind of know that they are two separate entities. The next thing that you should know that's really important is that bills, right? The I'm just a bill from Schoolhouse Rock, that is literally walking through a bill is an idea of a law that's going to be proposed. And so it has to go through a series of different steps in order to be able to hopefully move on to pass and become an actual law. So bills can be created or drafted by a legislator, and they can do it on their own because it's an area of interest of theirs, or it could be brought to them from a group of constituents or different parties or affiliations that they have that tell them they want to make a change. And so they can draft that bill in their chamber of origin, so whether that's the House or the Senate, and then it needs to be dropped and read and assigned to a particular committee. And so if it moves out of that first read and is sent to a committee, then it must be heard on in that particular committee. So an example would be if it's a bill about making sure that roadways are safe, it's most likely going to go to the Transportation Committee. If you hear about maybe proposed taxes on gas, that's going to go through the Transportation Committee, things like that. So those bills will be heard on and in those particular committees where they may have a reading of the bill and then testimony. And this is where people can engage in providing their feedback to the committee on whether or not they like or dislike that bill, or if there's any recommended changes that they should be hearing to consider. And then they would deliberate and then hopefully vote that bill out of committee. And they have to do it by committee of origin cutoff. So there's a series of cutoffs that need to happen for a bill to stay alive. And so if they make it out of that committee of origin, then if there's any money attached to it, if it's going to cost the state any money, it's got to make it out of that committee of origin and move its way over and do the same exact process with the financial committees. So in the House, that is the Appropriations Committee. In the Senate, it's the Ways and Means. And so they have to essentially listen to what the bill is, how much money it's going to cost, and then for that bill to stay alive, it must be voted out of the fiscal committee. And then there is a halfway midway point in the legislative session where the bills will then switch to the other side. So a bill will stay alive essentially all the way until that first cutoff if it makes it through every committee. And then when it switches in the midway point, all of the bills that have made it will go to the opposite chamber. So if it starts in the House, halfway point comes into play, and then it will switch over and it will go to the Senate and vice versa. So that's kind of how you want to make sure you're meeting these particular cutoffs to make sure that bill stays alive. You'll often hear the term, the bill is dead, and that means that it didn't make it out of any one of those committees of origin or it didn't make it through the fiscal committee. So a bill may be heard, but there was no vote. So if it doesn't push out, then that bill is essentially still there, but it's not necessarily going to do anything, and it may come back the next year. So then once everything is flipped, it needs to make it through that same series of committee reviews, needs to be heard, debated on. And then if it survives all of that, it heads down to the floor where they have debate, and then they vote that out. And then ideally, if it works for everyone, the governor will sign it or they will veto it and go back and forth. So that's essentially how the bills move forward. And then when you have the bill signed into law, depending upon what that bill says, it will be placed into law either the day it's signed or at a date later in time. So that's essentially how proposals come through and kind of walks through some of those big critical steps for making some law changes in Washington State. I hope that wasn't too much, too soon, too quickly. If anybody has questions, happy to pause for just a hot second before I start moving on to like, how do you look up a bill? I see no nods. I'm going to keep going then. So because you want to make sure that you're monitoring bills or kind of if you wanted to even have kind of an eye on what is happening in the legislative session, there is a lot of different ways that you could look up a bill. You could look it up by number. So maybe somebody has told you a bill number and you can look it up literally by plugging in that number and it will tell you exactly what that bill is. You could also look it up by content. They have a whole series of different committees and subject areas that you can kind of take a look at when the bills are dropped. Or you could look by sponsor, and that is the legislator that's proposed the bill. And you could see whether it is the representative or senator themselves, or if it is a request from an agency. So you can kind of get an idea of who's asking for this particular change and see who else has co-signed. So they have the primary sponsor and then numbers of co-sponsors who sign on. There's a website on the Washington State Legislature page where that you can look at the committees, you can check out the schedules, you can see what bills have been dropped, when they will have a hearing, and then you can check the status on what that bill is, whether it's made it out of committee, whether it's up for review, or if they change. But there are lots of bills that you would be surprised continue to be proposed year after year. They look kind of familiar and they kind of go through that process, but it's pretty accessible. And the website now, they launched it last year, is much, much, much easier for folks to navigate, to kind of figure out what bills are dropped, what bills are in what status, and then sort of how you can participate and share your feedback with the legislature. So if you've never read a bill before, it kind of looks, one, it's not a very accessible format. So I'll share, if you have visual disabilities and or you need a screen reader, the font and the way these things look, it's not very accessible. It looks very wonky, and the language is very, it's formatted in a very particular way. So the language is not necessarily accessible either. So I say that because I'll give you an example of what a bill looks like, but you want to be mindful of keeping an eye on, well, what is the actual number of this bill? Who is the sponsor? How did they title it? And then what rule or what law is the enacting clause that they attach this particular bill to? And then you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye out for, if they're adding a new section, you'll see an underline under the text, or there'll be a little box that says it's a new section. Or if it is removing a section and making a change, you'll see a strike through or a line right through that text. So it tells you that that's being removed. And then at the bottom of it, you will see when this bill turns into an actual law. So those are the key things you want to keep an eye out for. Here, Oh, my little hand helper is here. So my example of how to read a bill is right here. You're seeing right here at the top, it's Senate Bill 7999, so you know exactly what the number is. You're seeing right here, it is from Senators Green and Blue, and it is a request of a particular legislative, or excuse me, of a particular government agency. Then the amending clause here is telling you exactly what they're trying to propose. They are trying to make a change to a particular law, and they want it to be enacted by a particular day. So the next page shows you a couple of different examples of this is deleted language, and then this is new language. So they are making a change that something needs to be done in 60 days rather than 30 days. And then they've added in a couple of new sections to make changes to that law. So typically, if you are someone who's reading a bill and you want to understand what it's proposing, you want to keep an eye on what's new. And what's really great about our legislature and the process is you could read this full long bill, but if it goes to a hearing, they typically have a quick overview, one-page summary, and there is a nonpartisan staffer who goes through, or a couple of staffers who read through the proposal, and then they kind of give you the Spark Notes version. So you can see all of these details, and it's a lot more digestible to understand exactly what they are doing and why they're doing it. And then it also can include anybody who has signed in to demonstrate that they are pro, con, or other. So they support the bill, they don't support the bill, or maybe they don't necessarily want to support it or not. They want to make some recommended changes. You can kind of keep an eye on that because it's all documented. I'll pause right here because that was a lot of content. Do you have any questions on reading the bill, taking a look at it? And if not, I can keep chugging along. I'm going to take that as we'll keep moving. So for the College Success Foundation, our legislative priorities for this upcoming session is to ask the legislature to continue funding our partnership with the Passport Network. And then we also want to ensure that our funding for our L1000 scholarship program continues to be funded. So both of those are in partnership with the Washington Student Achievement Council. We would like that to continue because that is a critical part of our public-private partnership. And then last year, you may have been aware or made aware that the Washington State fiscal health was maybe not as strong as we would have hoped. And so we dealt with pretty, I would say, severe reductions in lots of different places. And so for this year, the College Success Foundation, our top priority is to secure $1 million in funding for our college services programs. And that's because we have a lot of students who benefit from our college access work, but this is where we want to focus on supporting the students who are currently receiving college services, one-on-one advising, coaching, navigation, so that way they can persist through college and then be successful and complete their degrees and enter into, hopefully, a thriving job opportunity. So we're trying to regain some of our footing in the funding that we may have been reduced last year and really focus on our college services. Last year, we were notified that the Washington State budget was looking very, very dire. And so there were many millions of dollars of cuts that we received kind of across all areas. And in particular, there's a lot of reductions in the nonprofit space. And so we are anticipating that those cuts and reductions are going to continue into this supplemental budget that's going to be negotiated. Typically, in the 2-year budget biennial cycle, the first year of that budget discussion tends to be the more generous of the two, and the supplemental, because it's only operating for the 1 year, is not as flexible maybe as the first year of the budget. So we're anticipating that the constraints that we saw last year are going to continue. You may have heard or seen an announcement that was made from Governor Ferguson and his team that he is working on preparing his proposed budget that will drop later this month in December before the new legislative session begins. And in some of the conversations that have been had around our state budget, Governor Ferguson is looking to make an all cuts proposed budget. So we are looking at even more reductions. And once Governor Ferguson drops his proposed budget, that will be heard in the fiscal committees at the start of session. And our Senate and House will develop their own budget proposals, and then they'll negotiate between the two. So knowing that we are continuing to anticipate budget reductions, and there are many other organizations that received significant loss at the end of last year's legislative session, it's looking like another unique opportunity for us to explore ways to be innovative and to try to capture how we can encourage ways to generate revenue for Washington State to support the work that we do. Because again, our students are particularly vulnerable. They need particular sets of infrastructure and support services. And that means that we have to invest in these partnerships and the work that we do. And we have to be mindful that that has to be paid for somehow. So trying to figure out ways to partner with the legislature and our other nonprofit partners and agencies to figure out how we can do that sustainably. So all of that into context, most of the budget concerns that we had last year were really built around what's happening in Washington State. Many of those things were also not necessarily informed by what is happening with the federal government and the big, beautiful bill and what does that look like. So we're anticipating a bit more preparedness around what does it look like to consider what's happening from the federal government, potential shutdowns, and sustainability for Washington State while considering what might be coming down from our federal administration and what's going on in our legislative branch at the federal level. So keeping that all in mind, CSF has really intentionally considered how we want to regain some funding for a public-private partnership to intentionally do it in a modest way to keep us sustained and to consider how we can future plan for the next series of legislative sessions and budget cycles. That stated, legislative work is not just something that I encourage only the people who are in the know to be engaged in. Everybody benefits from having the opportunity to participate in our lawmaking and sort of the civic engagement part. It's our responsibility to hold our legislators responsible for the decisions that they make. And so there's a lot of different ways in which you, your students, your partners can share your thoughts and perspectives and ideas with legislators. And it's made available for all of us for a reason. And so there's, of course, you can observe, you can watch hearings, and you can watch debate on TVW. That's available anytime. You can watch that on your local TV station, but you can also sign in and testify and provide your backing or your opinion on a bill once it's dropped. And you can do that. Thank you. You can do that in person, you can do that virtually, and you can also do it in a written format. And then there's the more, I would say, subtle version, which is noting your position for the record. And that means that you can just say you're pro, you're con, or other online, and just sign in without providing any additional details around, I would like this bill to be changed in these ways, but you can note your position to say, yes, we think that's a good idea. The next thing that you can do is you can also meet with a legislator, right? They are here working on our behalf. So you can reach out directly to a legislator. My recommendation would be that you reach out to the legislator and their legislative assistant, because they are the one who keeps them up and running, kind of holds their life in their hands. But you can reach out to them directly and they can meet with you in your local community, or you could come down to Olympia to meet with them, or a lot of them also hold their meetings virtually as well. But that is a really great way to build a relationship and to really give them an idea of what is a priority for you and the students you work with and your partners and your region. Because as I said before, these legislators are people who live and work in your community, but they may not be aware of the work that you do, and they may not be aware of the students that you serve. So we can bridge that gap and work with folks together. And the more people we have engaging with the legislature to hear what our priorities are, I think really does develop a more engaged and I think effective government. Mommy. Some particular groups that I recommend engaging with if you're working with students is there's three listed here, but there are more. But right here, I have WSA, which is the Washington Student Association. This is comprised of our public 4-year colleges and universities. And then there are a series of our 2-year colleges that are also participating in the Student Association. They develop legislative priorities. They have students who are going down and advocating and working with the legislature. And it's a really great way to kind of get the student priorities communicated directly with the legislature. So it's a great way to have peer-to-peer mentorship and engagement around legislative and policy work. The next group is called WASEN. That is the Washington Student Engagement Network, and that is statewide, working with both 2- and 4-year public and private universities, and they have regional-based student representatives who help coordinate student voice, and they help connect students with opportunities to come down to Olympia and engage with a lobby day, work one-on-one with legislators, and kind of get a tour, see how things are functioning, and to share their perspective with the legislature. As a group, they do not lobby, but they do provide students with toolkits to be prepared to do their legislative advocacy work. The last one is a very complicated looking acronym, but it is simple to sound out. It's called WAXA, and that is the Student Association for the 34 Community and Technical Colleges. So WAXA has a student association that represents those 34 colleges. They also develop their legislative priorities, and then they have an advocacy day where they come down to the Capitol and then meet with their legislators to share their priorities. When each of these particular student groups come together, they really do share what is going on with students at our colleges and paints a picture of how critical programs like Passport, programs like our Washington College Grant, and others are to ensuring their success as students. And it paints a picture of the diverse types of students that are at these different types of colleges and the wants they have around how they obtain a post-secondary credential or how they can access and be supported and sustained through it. So it's a really incredible opportunity for young people to catch the ear of legislators. And I'll tell you, legislators love to meet with students. They really appreciate when a young person is actually coming in and engaging with them. And I would, any day that there's a student there, I would rather take a step back and have the student take the opportunity to meet with that legislator. One, because I know the legislator enjoys that more. And two, because that opportunity for a student to see that their voice can have a direct impact on decisions that get made, it's a powerful experience. So there's lots of different opportunities. Students can also do internships through their individual college and participate that way. But these student associations are a great way where students don't have to work harder, they can work smarter, and they can get access to resources without having to build it from scratch. Okay, that concludes the overarching content that I had prepared. I told you 30 minutes, and I truly meant 30 minutes because this work can become overwhelming if we just kind of dive into each particular place. But happy to answer questions, to share any thoughts or address anything that might be looming in your mind if you've never considered doing this work before.
Yokiko, I did have not so much a question, but hoping you might be able to um, expand a little bit more about like students' participation. I know you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
testifying on a bill, and you
Mm-hmm.
shared some of those really important student groups that they can join. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, to work smarter, not harder.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious if you could share anything about kind of what student involvement could look like in
Mm-hmm.
like should we say like the off season when
Mm-hmm.
session is not taking place at the start of the year.
Yeah. So what I'll share is that one of the things that like for WSA, for WSA in particular, because that has not a broader net, but the structure that they have when they develop their legislative priorities, they are doing that in the fall. So they wait until the academic year begins, and then that's when they kind of go out and do sort of meeting and engagement. So they're going out to these different colleges, and then they're asking students to be involved and then to participate in a forum where they develop those legislative priorities, to which they will then share with the legislature in the upcoming session. For WAXA, they actually developed that in the spring after session concludes. And the reason behind that, and they sometimes adjust based on who is leading the group, but historically it's been in the spring, and that's because our 2-year colleges typically have a quicker turnover. And so to be able to encourage a more equitable development of those legislative priorities, they typically try to develop it in the spring and then adapt it in the fall to then do it again in the upcoming legislative session. But in the fall is a great way to invite legislators to come visit the campus, to engage with the students as they're developing their legislative priorities. So scheduling a visit or an open house that a legislator could come visit, or having the students come down and meet with their legislators during session, of course, is always an option. But then that little window of time between when session concludes, whether it is in March in a short session or April in a longer session, the time in which session concludes and then the negotiation of when the final budget gets signed by the governor, that's a pretty critical time in which people are sort of trying to figure out what is going to happen when. And then in preparation for that new fiscal year to start. So Washington State's fiscal year begins on July 1 every single year. And so that little window of time between when session concludes and the budget is signed, put into place and prepared, and then, policies, once they've been passed or made into law, get implemented by agencies and different entities. That little window of time in the winter or in the spring is pretty critical to be able to continue the conversation with legislators on what had happened during session and then how they can prepare for the next year and what those priorities might be. So it's a great opportunity for really all sorts of constituents to follow up with legislators, and they can meet in the in-between of at the Capitol or in their local region. So it gives opportunities for folks to say like, hey, this bill that we just passed, like, we're so excited about it, and maybe participate in a bill signing, or say, hey, we know that this session was hard. We care about students and, I want to thrive. I want to be able to survive as a college student. How can I do that when I know that this change that just was made makes it harder for me to stay? So kind of really creating that partnership opportunity and meeting with folks in a lot of different manners. I think anytime you have an event, inviting a legislator is not a bad idea.
Thank you.
I see the question in the chat. I'll read it out loud and respond. So the question is it required for organizations like CSF who have existing public-private contracted relationships to request the legislative session to maintain the funding amount they receive from the state? Or is it more about continuing to demonstrate the validity and importance of the work being done? That's a really great question. So it really is more about the total fiscal request that we have put forward is to continue to retain the funding, because each item in the budget has to be decided upon and approved in that budget negotiation between the entities, right? Between the House, the Senate, and then the governor. So each party has their own priorities, and then they negotiate, go back and forth. And because those state dollars are coming to the College Success Foundation, you never want to assume that a funding partnership is going to automatically be funded, unless, of course, it's written into law or to statute, because those things can change. And so an example would be many of the funding streams that CSF had in previous legislative sessions and in previous budgets, that was in a section of the budget that was completely eliminated last year. And so we put in those requests were not funded. And that was to continue all of that. And we had new funding included in that as well. And so that's why we have to make that request to continue funding this because we demonstrate. And with those partnerships that we have, CSF is engaged in a contract, right? So we have a responsibility to uphold our contract responsibilities and demonstrate that with our partnership with the Student Achievement Council and other work that we do. So we provide some of those metrics to demonstrate how we're meeting those targets and those goals. But then, of course, we're always going to think about how can we continue to invest in these partnerships that we have or the work that we are doing on behalf of bettering not just the sustainability of our organization, but for the benefit of the students across the regions that we serve. So it is very nicely going through that same process of saying, well, you funded us before, we hope that you continue because this is the good work that we're doing. And I think we're now in a place where we can say you can't assume that funding, if it was funded before, is not up for discussion as to whether it will continue to be funded. So asking for that and being very clear about the total amount that we're asking for, why we're asking for it, whether it is funds that already exist. So typically if it already exists, it's easier to articulate why you should continue funding it. When you have new funding, you have to be a bit more prepared to explain why. Well, why would we want to invest more, especially when we're in a budget crisis where there's less dollars to go all the way around. So articulating exactly why this new funding stream or this new line of funding is critical and the impacts that it will have on the regions that we serve is very important to us. So hopefully that answered your question. I see a thank you, so I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay. Anything else you'd like to know? There's no such thing as a silly question when it comes to the legislature. I'll also share that one of the reasons why I think policy work feels a bit daunting is because laws are not easy to read. The legislative or parliamentary process is also something that a lot of us know exists, but maybe don't know how to do it. So I say that because the legislature feels very regal, right? You walk into the state capitol, you walk into one of these conference rooms and you feel a sense of, this feels very big. This feels like maybe I don't belong here because of the marble and the way that the rooms look and the policies and procedures that they follow feel inaccessible. And that is in some ways, by design, but in other ways, this is the people's house. This is the people's place. We are living in a democracy here where our votes matter, the way that we advocate on behalf of things that we care about matter, and that we continue to be persistent. So I believe that the policy work feels inaccessible because it feels unfamiliar and like you don't know what you're doing when you walk in. But I will be very, very clear that members of the House and Senate, they are just people, right? They are also just people. And they sometimes don't know parliamentary procedure and they need their staff people to remind them. And if you think that you're nervous to share your thoughts and your perspective in a 30-second, 1 minute or 2 minute testimony window, they are also just as nervous. So it feels as though it's something that is not built for you. But now with one of the benefits of COVID is that we've engaged in digital and virtual testimony, which didn't exist before, right? So if you came from Eastern Washington or Central Washington or Southern Washington or up north, in Bellingham, you had to drive to Olympia. It had to be in person. They would not do something. They would not accommodate you. You had to come here, which I think ties into accessibility. And now it is easier for you to engage. And with the internet, you can also note your position and write your testimony and share it online as well. But you can testify for a bill on Zoom and they ask you to turn your cameras on and they give you grace if it doesn't work the way you want, right? And they give you opportunities to share your perspective. And I believe that that's a great step forward. And so if it feels unfamiliar, don't worry, because so many people also don't know how to do it. And it's really just about taking that little bit of time to go in, share your thoughts, and don't worry if you're nervous because I promise you somebody has made a mistake and it is okay. And I have been doing this now for quite a few years. I still get nervous. I still get the butterflies. I still kind of sit there and like, oh, what am I doing? And it goes so quickly in a testimony. But as soon as you walk out of that formal hearing process and you just go chat with the legislator, again, or a staffer, they're still just people and they want to talk to you and they want to help. And I think most times they're very honest about what they can and can't do. So I think it's mostly about taking that little step really is a lot easier than you think. And that email to follow up with a legislator, it's very unlikely that it won't be responded to. You will get a response from someone, and it may come from their staffer, but that means someone's seen it and you can continue to reach out to them. So it feels like it shouldn't be there for you, but it is built for you. All right, then. So what I do have here is my name is long, but I'm the only Yokiko who works at the College Success Foundation, so I'm not hard to find. If you have questions or if something came up in what I was just sharing with you all today, you are more than welcome to follow up with me anytime. I'm happy to answer questions, happy to partner. I think what's particularly important for Passport that I think is really relevant is we know that the reductions to CSF are devastating for us as an organization, and we have had to re-envision where we are, what our footprint looks like. We also know that those same types of reductions happened to Treehouse and many of our other nonprofit partners. So what that means to us is that we know that these students are not receiving the type of support that they were before. And that means we are, I mean, just as committed as we ever were to really ensuring that that student voice and that student perspective is shared with the legislature to understand what that means, because that has disparate outcomes for our most vulnerable students. So I think it's very important to share just how impactful decisions made at last year's budget discussion and final budget, and the impacts that you see, the impacts that your students are telling you. It does not take long. It does not take long for the impact of these policies or these changes to directly hit students, staff, and campuses and partners. And that means that we have an opportunity to really share how much work and investment it will take for us to rebuild, re-envision, and sustain and support these students, because there is a very direct line between where vulnerable students are to incarceration rates, use of public benefits, and impacts to economic outcome. And that is something that leads not only to the health and sustainability of the individual student and their family and their networks, but to the greater picture of Washington State's economy and our own economic health and development, our workforce. Everybody is impacted by this, and our most vulnerable students are now navigating a complicated world with maybe more of a need for an all hands on deck approach to figuring out how to make it from point A to point B. So I say that your voice matters more now than ever. Being willing to share it and knowing that there are places you can go if you don't know how to do it. Happy to help you, happy to point you in the right direction, and happy to work with folks to share this with the legislator and our partners, because I think it's important. My email's in the chat box. That's not a bot, chat box. If you have questions, you can follow up with me anytime. I appreciate you taking the time to connect with me today. I think we've hit all those boxes for me. So I'll pass it to Ozzy.
Yes, thank you again, Yokiko, for joining us and sharing all this super useful information. And again, her email's in the chat. I've also included the Passport email if you want to get hold of the Washington Passport Network or anyone on the Passport team at CSF. And a quick reminder, I'm dropping in the chat right now a link to a quick survey. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out, feedback would be greatly appreciated and help us improve content moving forward. I'll be sure to include everything that was linked, all the resources that Yokiko shared throughout today's presentation. I'll add those to a follow-up email. And as soon as we get our recordings uploaded to our site and our YouTube channel, I'll be sure to share those out as well. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate your attendance. And again, definitely reach out if you have any questions. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.